Good morning and welcome to today's hearing. Those at the back will know what I'm going to say. You may use any mobile electronic device to transmit silently to the outside world what you've seen and heard at the inquiry, but only 10 minutes after the event which you are describing. 10 minutes have to elapse so that the video stream is not preempted. It is subject to a 10-minute delay. You may not use an electronic device for recording proceedings or taking photographs. Before Ms. German is sworn, may I apologise to you on behalf of the inquiry, as I know David Barr has already done, for the inconvenience to which you were put earlier this week, and may I express my gratitude to you for agreeing to return today to give evidence, I hope, in an uninterrupted day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Stand up, please, and repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Barr.
Thank you, sir. Dr. German, could you give us your full name, please?
Lindsey German.
You've provided a second witness statement to the inquiry, which is dated the 6th of March 2024. Are the contents of that witness statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
You tell us that you were elected to the Central Committee of the Socialist Workers' Party in 1979, and as I understand it, you remained a member of the Central Committee throughout the period which is material for our present purposes right through to the mid-90s and beyond.
That's right.
You tell us that your role on the Central Committee included setting day-to-day tasks. Could you give us a little bit of a flavour of what that means in practice?
Well, what it means is that we would have an annual conference and we would have regular national meetings, and we would decide what we thought priorities were, and then depending on what job you had, you would try to implement those perspectives. So, for example, when I was women's organiser, I might organise meetings, I edited the magazine, I encouraged branches to do certain things, we would have certain priorities that we wanted them to follow. It would be those kind of things. Later on, I edited the review magazine, so that was my main job at the time. But again, it would involve travelling the country, talking to districts and branches, and getting them to do certain things that we thought were appropriate to do, support for a demonstration, support for a strike, those kind of things.
And in terms of the organisation of demonstrations, what level of involvement did you have?
Well, that depended very, very much on the demonstration. Usually, the demonstrations weren't organised by the SWP. They were organised by various bodies, broader trade union bodies, or maybe groups of anti-fascists, for example, as was the case with Welling. So they would not just be organised by the SWP, they would be organised by a broad range of people. So that depended. It very often was the case. I would just be saying to people, can you book coaches to come on this demonstration? Or can you turn up at the demonstration?
I understand there'd be some demonstrations you'd organise and some which you would support. Am I right to understand that the Central Committee met quite regularly?
It met every week.
And would that mean that you would discuss a demonstration before and after it occurred?
That very much, again, depended on the size of the demonstration, the nature of the demonstration. Very often they were just things that we wouldn't discuss in any great detail. We would say there's a demonstration about a particular topic. We'd like people to support it, but we wouldn't go into any great detail about it.
Can I ask you, what was your, in general terms, we'll come to specifics later on, but in general terms, what was the level of your personal attendance at demonstrations and rallies that the party either organised or supported?
With national demonstrations, obviously I would be on quite a lot of them. Again, it varied, but yes, I would say I would be on quite a lot of the demonstrations that were taking place. With local ones, it was much less likely that I would be on one. But for example, in the early 1980s, the Labour Party organised a lot of demonstrations over unemployment. And I remember travelling to Liverpool, where there was a very, very big, a huge demonstration for a demonstration outside of London, which I was part of, but I was part of it as an ordinary member. I wasn't organising it. That was organised by the Labour Party.
Thank you. I'd like to move now to showing you some of the documents that were compiled about the Socialist Workers' Party to explore whether or not they're accurate. I'd like to start with a document compiled by the Security Service, their Brief Guide to Subversion of 1985. So it's at tab C1, and for the projector it's 32553. This is the first page, Dr. German. Just to orientate ourselves, you will see it is the Brief Guide to Subversion in Great Britain. I can tell you it's the 1985 version, and this is the section about the Socialist Workers' Party. The bit I'd particularly like to ask you about first is on the second page at the top, the section entitled Ideology / Policies. The Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, is a Trotskyist organisation, see Trotskyism 2. Its objective is, therefore, the overthrow of the capitalist system and its replacement by a form of government based on workers' councils protected by a workers' militia. If I just stop there, is that factually accurate?
Yes, in the sense that we always stood for the overthrow of the system, but we also saw it as something which we saw as a democratic process. So I would say this is rather a kind of, well, it is a very condensed sort of version of it, and its replacement by a form of government based on workers' councils. Yes, but that was something that we based very much on the idea that people would organise those from below, that they would be things that were based on workplaces, in communities and so on. Protected by a workers' militia is a kind of, is a very condensed way of looking at it, that you might, you would say in those situations that we always feared, as was the case with many revolutions that did take place, that the threat of violence came from counter-revolution, and that therefore we would be prepared to defend ourselves, but it would be seen in that context. So, yeah, that would be my caveats to that particular description of it, I suppose.
Okay. If we carry on, and it's believed that a socialist revolution could not survive in one country in isolation, must, in consequence, be built internationally.
That's right, yes.
It is opposed to the use of terrorism and indiscriminate violence, but believes that violence may be necessary to achieve political aims and to consolidate any revolution achieved.
Well, I think the important phrase there is actually to consolidate any revolution achieved, because, again, we looked at the examples, for example, of Chile, where there was a democratically elected left government, which was overthrown by a very violent coup with 10,000 people dead in 1973. So I suppose that we would say that in that situation, you do need to defend yourself, as the Chilean government attempted to do, unfortunately, not successfully. So yes, again, to put it in that context, I think it's very important to put it in the context that it isn't, our whole tradition, our whole politics were not the idea of a kind of left-wing coup which would take over from the existing government. We believed that you could only achieve socialism, I still do believe this, you could only achieve socialism by an organic movement based on working class people organising themselves and therefore presenting an alternative to existing government.
Could we now move to the next page of the same document? Thank you. At the top, there are some membership figures which cover the first few years of the period we're interested in. Dr. German, this isn't a memory test, nor am I seeking absolute precision.
Good.
Are these figures in the right ballpark?
I guess so. I'm just thinking, I mean, I joined in 72. We had around 3,000 or 4,000 members then, so it says 2,350, but then it goes up to 3,500 in 74. 77, we definitely were bigger by then because there'd been the very big movements against the Tory government and then continued to a certain extent under Labour. I think it's true that in the early 80s we declined somewhat as a result of the general changes in politics overall, the rise of Thatcher, the defeat of the miners and so on. I'm a bit surprised by 85 because I thought that after the miners' strike we did actually recruit some people. I'm surprised it's lower in 85 than it was in 84. But I would suggest that these are fairly accurate figures, yeah.
Just settling on that 1977 figure of over 5,000, did the resurgence at that time of the far right in the form of the National Front have anything to do with growth in membership?
I think so. I think it would have been one of the main drivers of membership. People were extremely concerned about the rise of the National Front. It did very, very well in elections for a time. It was a real threat on the streets. So I think people will have felt they needed to get involved and get more committed to socialist politics. And I think that's what that reflected.
Thank you. The bottom of that page, it says activities. The party's main activities are A, the fostering of industrial disputes. Until 1982, it operated within trade unions through the rank and file movement, but members now take part in union activity and industrial disputes openly. So first of all, is it right that the SWP fostered industrial disputes?
Well, certainly we encourage people who wanted to go on strike to do so. And in some cases, you'll have a situation, I know from my own union branch, where people say, we'd like more pay. Should we go on strike to get it, or is it impossible to do so? So there are those debates, and we would have been on the side of people wanting to go on strike. I don't think this is quite accurate, though, about I mean, maybe you're going to ask me about this, I don't know, about the rank and file movement wasn't open. It was a very open movement in a whole number of unions, so people knew about it. It was a way of gathering together people in a particular union to promote the most militant policy that we thought would be appropriate at the time.
You've saved me the question. Thank you very much. And we can take this document down now. And can we go to a similar document only many years later? This is the Security Service's Brief Guide to Subversion 1995, tab C3, sir, 36610. And if we go, first of all, to page 3, please. Just to look at the membership figures again, bringing the second half of the 80s and the first half of the 90s into play. Again, the question is, for that period after 1985, are the figures recorded there in the right ballpark?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think the 94 figure of 10,000, while it may have been claimed, is probably a bit higher than we actually had. But I would say we had several thousand members would be how I would describe it, yeah.
And would if the absolute numbers aren't quite right, would the broad trend that there was an escalation in membership in the early 1990s with a particular spike between 92 and 94, are the trends correct?
I'm not quite sure about that, to be honest. It seems to me you are saying it, or the figures are saying that it's nearly doubling in 2 years. I would have thought that's probably a bit more than it was. In other words, it may have gone from 6,000 to 7,000 or 8,000, rather, which wouldn't be such a dramatic increase. That would be my guess on it.
Okay, and moving to the drivers for those, is one of the drivers the poll tax?
The poll tax definitely was a thing that did galvanise a very big movement, and a very big movement which people again looked towards socialist organisations to join. I mean, not just the SWP, other ones as well. So yeah, that would have been one of the things.
And would it be the resurgence of the far right, this time in the form of the British National Party?
Yes, that would have been a factor, although I think if you look at the period of the early 90s, people were very, very shocked that Labour didn't win the election in 92, and I think that therefore there were a whole number of issues that came up that you had this Tory government for the next 5 years. There was obviously the rise of the far right was a very serious concern that people had. There had been the poll tax, although they obviously had to abandon that. There was also things like the Criminal Justice Bill, which was very unpopular. So there was a range of different issues, I would say, around that time that led to it.
And would the collapse of the Eastern Bloc style of communism also have been included in the drivers?
Now, that's a very big question, and I'm not sure we benefited that much from recruitment over that. As I'm sure you're aware, the SWP actually was well known for being an organisation which never thought Russia was socialist. We described it as state capitalist. And one might have thought that around that time we might get the benefit of that, of being correct in that analysis. But actually, I think what happened was that one of the factors around the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was that it led to a demoralisation among socialists who had illusions in it. And I think that tended to affect the whole left. So I'm not sure. I mean, we probably did recruit people out of it, but not in significant numbers, I wouldn't have said.
We may come back to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But for the moment, I think we can move on from that page to the next page, to page 4, to touch upon something you have just mentioned. This is the activities paragraph of the brief guide, and I'm interested in drawing your attention, Dr. German, to subparagraph D. The party's main activities are, and D is, campaigning on social and political issues such as the Community Charge and more recently the Criminal Justice Act. The party has been among the leading opponents of the Act through its representation on the CACJA, although it has not been involved in the violence that has accompanied some of the demonstrations against the Act. So first of all, is it right that that was one of the SWP's main activities at this time? Yes,
and I was one of the people on the main body of the CACJA. So yes, I was quite involved in that campaign, and we did see it as very important. We saw it as an attack on civil liberties and something that we thought was important to oppose.
And the way that the SWP mobilised on that issue, is it right that that did not involve violence?
That's right. We organised a mass demonstration, which unfortunately did end in violence because of the policing of the demonstration, which was I felt was very, very severe. But certainly our intention was a mass peaceful demonstration.
Could we take that document down now, please, and go to 31619? So this is not in the bundle. This is a 1991 document, and it's about your amended constitution that I want to ask. So this is a report submitting a post-conference bulletin in 1991 with the amended constitution. If we could go to the next page, please, on the left-hand column on the first page, the paragraph numbered 1. And I'm interested, I'll read it all out for those who are following online. The Socialist Workers' Party is an organisation of revolutionary socialists dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism internationally and the construction of a world socialist system. The SWP stands in and develops the revolutionary communist tradition of Marx, Lenin and Trotsky, as opposed to the social democratic and Stalinist traditions. Just stopping there, that's the distinction you were adverting to a moment ago, isn't it?
That's right.
With the state capitalists.
That's right.
Standing as it does in this tradition, the SWP believes that the working class is the only force capable of building socialism in the world. Therefore, it strives to construct a revolutionary party composed in its overwhelming majority of workers. The SWP is democratic centralists because the Revolutionary Party must be a disciplined, activist, combat organisation. It is democratic in reaching its decisions and centralist in carrying them out. Stopping there, combat organisation. What does that mean?
What it means is that it's a fairly common term that's used about organisations of these sorts, and what it means is that we want to be an organisation which is fighting alongside the working class in order to challenge many of the assumptions of government, of employers, of all those things. It doesn't mean, when it says combat organisation, it doesn't mean a military organisation. It means in the sense, perhaps if you talked about combating, you talk about combating ideas, or you talk about combating a particular agenda by an employer, for example, it's meant in that sense. So it's meant as an organisation which is centred on working class organisation, which is centred in the trade unions and argues for the kind of path that we think is going to be successful. That's what it means. It doesn't mean we have a military wing or anything like that, because that was very far from our aim.
Thank you. If we could take that down now, please. What I would like to understand is a little bit about the SWP's conception of the police in a capitalist society. As I understand it, central premise is as a ruling class exploiting the working class. The SWP wants to build a movement to overthrow the ruling class and replace it with the sort of government that we saw in the synopsis. Is it the view of the SWP that the role of the police in a capitalist society is essentially to keep the ruling class in power?
The view of the SWP is that there exists what we sometimes call the state machine, which includes the police, which includes the army, which includes a whole range of bodies which are there in order to ensure that the people who already rule do continue to rule, and that the police, in that sense, are seen as people who act in the interests of the ruling class at any one time. And I would argue that that is correct. I think if you look at the role of the police in a whole number of the disputes that perhaps we're going to come on to talk about, you can see that it's very, very clearly it is in order to weaken trade union organisation, to weaken the effect of industrial action. We saw this in the miners' strike, we saw it in Wapping. And so that would be our view of it, yes.
And as you would see it, they will act violently if necessary to secure their aim.
Well, I think, to be perfectly frank, that is incontrovertible. I think that we've seen this time and time again, and we have hearings and we have inquiries going on into issues like Orgreave and Hillsborough and some of these things, and I think we've seen that the police can act violently and do act violently, and on certain occasions. Now, this isn't true about every policeman you meet on the street or even on demonstrations. I mean, I organise a number of demonstrations where we liaise with the police in a perfectly open and, I think, a perfectly reasonable manner, and I think they would say that. But we know that at times that isn't the case, and we know that on those occasions the police do act violently.
And I think, is it a fair summary of your witness statement? You develop in some detail a trend after Margaret Thatcher comes into power of the police changing and becoming harder in the way that they police disputes such as the miners' strike, Wapping, Warrington, and so forth.
Yes, I think that if you look at the police under Thatcher, it does, there's certainly no question that it, and again, this isn't just the view of the SWP, I think that any academic study will show you that the police do increase the level of combativity, the level of violence, the use of riot police, the use of all these things. I think that is simply the way that it developed, and I think Thatcher was determined to destroy the miners, and she made sure that the police were very, very well equipped for doing this sort of thing, and she succeeded in doing this. She succeeded in, the police were definitely politically involved in the whole Wapping dispute. I think, again, if you look at the evidence of the closeness between Rupert Murdoch and Margaret Thatcher, I don't think that isn't a matter of question, really. It is a matter of fact, I think. So yes, I think it definitely accelerated under Margaret Thatcher.
And what was, in broad terms, the SWP's response to the hardening of policing during the 1980s?
Well, in broad terms, we very much opposed it. We very much opposed the kind of policing that we saw at places like Orgreave. We thought that this was a very politically motivated thing, which was designed to weaken not just the left, but the whole of working class organisation, the whole of the trade unions. That was the purpose, I think, of this kind of policing. At the same time, and again, if you look at the example of the miners' strike, we argued very much against individual solutions to this kind of violence. We argued for a collective thing. I mean, I don't know if you recall, but there was a terrible case where people dropped, I don't know what it was, a brick or something, which on a taxi taking a miner to work when the strike was still going on. And we regarded this as individual action, which was simply, it was both wrong and counterproductive, and we were very much opposed to that sort of thing. But at the same time, we did think that the way in which the policing went in the 80s was remarkably increase in the level of policing and in the level of violence of policing.
Moving to the Cold War, whilst the Cold War was still happening, did the SWP have a public position on the stance it would take in the event that the Cold War went hot?
Well, we opposed the idea of nuclear war. We opposed the idea that that there could be destruction between ourselves and Russia and so on. Sorry, am I not?
No,
I'm not answering.
My question isn't clear enough. If you could strip away the possibility of a nuclear apocalypse, if a conventional war had broken out in Europe between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, did the SWP have a position on that?
Well, we would be opposed to both sides in the war. We wouldn't have been in favour of... we wouldn't have supported Russia, but we would have also said, I think, that the arming, the increase in nuclear weapons, the increase in conventional weapons, actually contributed to the possibility of war. We were arguing all the time for an end to this kind of militarism. That was one of our main features. We didn't, I guess we never explicitly said, if there was a war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, we would support the Warsaw Pact or we wouldn't support the Warsaw Pact. I guess that was something that we just took the line. We were against wars on both sides, and we saw both sides as major imperial powers, which, you know, you're saying don't mention nuclear war, but actually any conventional war involving both those sides would have rapidly headed towards some form of nuclear war, which is what the cruise missiles were all about. They were the idea you could have a kind of tactical, contained nuclear war in Europe, and we regarded that as just simply not the case.
Did it remain the case during the years we're now talking about, so in the 1980s and the first half of the 90s, that the SWP had no foreign nation state backing it?
No, never. We've never had any foreign nation state backing us.
And did it remain the case during this period that there was no Trotskyist government in the world?
Unfortunately not. Partly because, as we've already referred to, we didn't think you could have socialism in one country.
You need a global revolution.
That's right, yeah.
Can I move now to some of the reporting on the Central Committee? If we could have up, please, a document which you will find, sir, at B24, 19923. This is an SDS report dated the 24th of March 1992, and it comprises a list of leading personalities in the SWP with some description of each. Now, the ones that I want to ask you about are, first of all, on this page, the description of Chris Bambury under the heading Central Committee Members. It's right, isn't it, that Mr. Bambury was a Central Committee member?
Yes, that's right.
It describes him, and this is a report by the officer we know as HN90, an aggressive individual with a mercurial temperament. He is regularly present at demonstrations and other public order events in the London area for the purpose of directing and controlling the SWP contingent. First of all, in your how much experience did you have of Mr. Bambury?
Oh, a great deal.
And how long had, just in years term, how much had you known him?
I've known him since 1981, I think. Yeah.
Was he an aggressive individual?
Not at all. No, in my opinion, I'd say the opposite. I'd say he wasn't an aggressive individual.
Did he ever have moments of aggression?
Not that I would recall, no.
Were there any subjects that might elicit aggression from him, for example, particularly emotive issues?
Well, he was a Celtic supporter, football supporter, so he got emotive about that, I guess. And he, like all of us as socialists, there were things that made us very upset and at times made us angry.
The far right?
Of course, but that doesn't mean you're aggressive, does it? It means that you are annoyed about something, which is rather a different
Indeed it is.
characteristic.
And I'm asking, did, for example, the activities of the far right prompt aggression from him?
No, I mean, he was on demonstrations and he would be opposed to the far right, and that was absolutely clear, and that would have been true of hundreds or even thousands of SWP members, but I don't regard him as particularly aggressive.
Did he have a mercurial temperament?
I wouldn't have described it as such, no.
Was he regularly present at demonstrations?
Yes, that's true, yeah.
And when he was, did his position mean that he did direct and control the SWP contingent?
Well, that would have depended on the demonstration. Sometimes he would have done and sometimes he wouldn't. And we had stewards on the demonstrations. He would have been a steward. Sometimes he might have been the main steward. Other times there would be other people doing that. So if he was in that role, then yes, he would have done.
How would you describe Mr. Bambury's temperament?
Well, I would say, I mean, he's a flamboyant person. He's quite an extroverted person, but I would say actually he's a very kind person at lots of levels. That's as I know him, and I know him quite well. I would say that would be how I would describe him. Now, I think we have to be very careful about these kind of, these sketch sketches of people which, talk in these terms. I mean, what is that based on? Is it based on seeing somebody who's shouting slogans at a demonstration, or is it based on any real knowledge? And I would suspect it's based on the former, if anything, rather than any real understanding of him.
If we could move to the next page, please, and the second paragraph down, which is the pen picture of you. It says, the editor of the Socialist Worker Review and a regular contributor to the various publications of the SWP, Privacy, she is regularly seen at public order events, but seems to adopt the role of an observer rather than an organiser of the SWP tactics.
Well, I'd say that isn't very accurate either, because, I mean, it's may well be true on a whole number of demonstrations, but I did, along with other members of the Central Committee and with other SWP members, we did discuss tactics, both on the demonstrations sometimes, and also sometimes we discussed these things in advance, and we would discuss certain things. So yes, I played that role. So I think, again, this is slightly, if you don't mind me saying, it's a slightly kind of, superficial view of what I was doing.
If we could move to the next page, please, and the paragraph about Pat Stack. I'm interested in particular towards the end. It says, he sometimes acts as a media spokesman for the SWP and has always refused to condemn acts of disorder at major events. Did he sometimes act as a media spokesman for the SWP?
I think what this is referring to is that after the poll tax demonstration, Pat, as it says here, had or has major disability and wasn't on the demonstration himself. So he acted as the spokesperson for the SWP. I remember that well on the day, and I think in subsequent days. And he put forward the case, which I think was absolutely right for him to do so, that he wasn't going to condemn the acts of that took place on that day, acts of disorder as it's called here, that he saw this poll tax demonstration as very much a demonstration which started as a peaceful demonstration and was attacked by the police. So that he did refuse to condemn those acts of disorder, but I very much agreed with him about that, because I think when you look at what happened on the poll tax demonstration, it was very clear that that is what happened. I mean, we may well be coming on to talk about this at a later point, and perhaps we can go into it more, but there is no doubt in my mind that the use of vans, the use of police horses, and the way in which the police reacted. I mean, I knew one person whose leg was broken in the course of that demonstration. So I think he was right to do so, and I think he was right to say there was a huge amount of discontent and anger over the poll tax, and that should have been taken into account, rather than the police just attacking the demonstration. As far as I know, that was the main point at which he acted as a media spokesman, but I couldn't say that categorically. But I think that's the one that's probably being referred to here.
It does say always refused, which suggests more than one incident.
Okay, well, as I say, I can't comment on what the other ones might have been, but it would probably have been for similar reasons, and I would have supported him in doing this. I think this is partly that we need to look at some of these acts, not just simply in terms of what the end result is, but how they get to the situation that they get to, and I think that would be helpful when we're discussing them.
Okay, thank you. And if we could go now to the paragraph below, Julie Watterson, thank you. An aggressive individual who attends most public order events within the London area. At such events, she invariably takes control of the SWP contingent and is capable of organising disruptive action. She has recently been to the forefront at anti-racist demonstrations where she has taken control of the SWP and anti-Nazi League supporters, and has antagonised the leadership of the Anti-Racist Alliance with her disruptive tactics. How well did you know Julie Waterson?
I knew her well. I knew Julie very well. Yeah, we were friends for many years, and she unfortunately died of cancer when she was quite young, about 10, 12 years ago, something like that. I mean, again, I really do dispute this this description of her, really. She was a very gregarious person. Like Chris Banbury, she was Scottish, and they both had quite strong Scottish accents, and she spoke forcefully. She did speak forcefully, but she was not an aggressive person at all. She was even shorter than I am. She was very short. She was somebody who was a very able organiser, and she did involve herself in a whole number of demonstrations and other activities. But I just think this description is completely inaccurate when you want to. And I think if you asked anybody who knew Julie, would the first thing that you say about her that she's an aggressive individual, they would not. And of course, she also did suffer quite a severe injury at the Welling demonstration, for which she did gain compensation from the police some years later. So I think, no, I don't really accept this. And when you talk about she's antagonised the leadership of the Anti-Racist Alliance with her disruptive tactics, well, actually, there was a political difference between her and us and the Anti-Racist Alliance, which was about how you combat fascism. So I think that's no doubt why, if they were antagonised, that's why they would have been antagonised rather than for any other reason.
If I just stop there and ask one specific question. Julie Waterson receiving compensation from the police, is that something that you know about firsthand from her?
It's something that's a matter of record, I think, that she received it as a result of the injury that she got some years later, but in about 2000, I think. But I can find the
essentially,
reference.
my question is, how do you know?
Because it's in the public record. I'll find it for you if that's helpful for the inquiry. I
think it might be. Thank you.
It would be. Okay, thanks.
And secondly, is it right that as a member of the Central Committee, Julie Waterson did have a prominent role at anti-racist demonstrations?
Yes, that is true. That's absolutely true. And she was the person who was central to the Anti-Nazi League when it was re-established in the early 90s.
And what was her working relationship with Mr. Banbury?
It was pretty okay, I think. They were both on the Central Committee. They did, as I've seen it reported in one of the statements, they were saying they were arguing at some sort of demonstration as to whether they should stop at the bookshop, I think it was,
yeah,
or carry on. And I can well believe that, because they were both, they were both that type of character who would be saying, no, I want to do this, and no, let's do this. But they got on, they were friendly, they got on all right, and they worked together over a whole range of things.
Right. So I'm sensing they're both strong personalities who might sometimes have differed, but sometimes not.
Yes, that's right, exactly, and that they both had, as I say, they were both very good speakers, and they were both had strong Scottish accents and all that. I don't know whether that means very much to you, but people thought that they were kind of quite, I don't know, the Scottish sort of thing was always a bit colourful, if you like, with both of them.
I see. Thank you. Right at the bottom of the page, Wayman Bennett. A volatile and autocratic individual who does not tolerate any criticism. He is not particularly intelligent. His aggressive nature has enabled him to progress up the party ladder. He is seen at most order events in London. How does that chime with your knowledge?
Well, I
Mr.
have to
Bennett?
say, I mean, Wayman is, as I don't know whether you know, but is black, and I think in particular he's not particularly intelligent. He's an intelligent guy, and you know, he's been to university, he's done all this sort of thing. So I don't really think the tone of that is particularly good. Again, volatile, autocratic, doesn't tolerate any criticism, aggressive nature. I mean, these are kind of like, they're such poor descriptions of people, really. They're so lacking any kind of nuance or any sort of, you know, I find it hard to really know how to respond to this particular one, because I don't think, if by aggressive nature it's meant that maybe people shout slogans on demonstrations or make militant speeches, as he would have done and would do today, then okay. But if that speaks to a whole aggressive nature, then I would say again, no, I don't recognise that.
How would you describe Mr. Bennett?
Well, I would describe him as somebody who actually has been campaigning over racism for many, many years. That's quite a tough thing to do when you're a black person. I would say he does tolerate criticism. I would say he is somebody that has been able to play a role in the anti-racist movement for a number of years, and that he's somebody who sometimes I might agree with and sometimes I wouldn't agree with over particular things. Sometimes you might even have an argument with him, but volatile and autocratic doesn't really kind of sum it up for me, really. So I think I would describe him in a very different way from that.
Could we take that document down now, please? I want to move now to Skegness. Now, it's right, isn't it, that the SWP would normally have an annual gathering at Skegness, and it was an important event in the SWP's annual calendar.
That's right. It happened every Easter. It was the Derbyshire Miners' holiday camp, which was notorious for sort of bad food and things like that. But people actually went for the weekend. We had lots and lots of meetings. There were also social events, football and entertainment in the bars in the evening and so on. So, yeah, it was an important part of our calendar, yeah.
And I'll be selective into what I take you to, but very heavily reported upon.
Absolutely. And, I mean, I don't know why it was so heavily reported on, but yes, it was.
Let's go to tab B5, 740701. This is the report of the 1986 event. If we could have the next page, please. And as you've rightly said, paragraph 2 records the venue in Skegness. Paragraph 3, the attendance at the rally was comparable to the previous year, approximately 2,000 being present, of whom some 200 were accommodated at the nearby North Shore Holiday Centre. In addition to 12 Iranian refugees, there were 15 members of the Socialist Workers' Movement and several contacts from the Middle East and South Africa who were present at the rally. So I think we can take two propositions from this. However bad the food, it was very popular, very large attendance.
Yes, and also it was a sort of family attendance, so people who might not have been in the SWP but were related to them or friends of them. Lots of people liked it because it did have, and some people went mainly for the social events and mainly so that they could be with, and it had a creche for the children, so people could spend some time going to meetings or enjoying themselves. So, yes.
We'll be very shortly coming back to that theme.
Okay.
But the second proposition, it attracted people who were not members of the Socialist Workers' Party. Plenty of people who attended not members.
That's right, yeah.
And so if we look over the page at paragraphs 7 and 8 of this report, Appendix A to this report gives a list of those members who presided over meetings during the course of the rally, and Appendix B contains a list of persons who attended the rally from the London area, approximately 590 adults and 72 children were present. And if we move to the next page and see Appendix A, You feature there about halfway down the page, don't you?
Let me have a look. Yes, I do.
And
yeah.
if we, thank you, and if we go to page 6, we see the first page of Appendix B. This starts with the barking branch, and although we have, of course, redacted a lot of the names to protect people's privacy, you can quite clearly see in the right-hand column that 2 of the people on that page are recorded as being infants. Do you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
And over the page again, we see more of the same. Some people who appear to be unidentified, or of whom there's no trace, or are infants. That appears to be the case, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'm showing you this because as a very senior member of the SWP at the time, I would like to give you the opportunity to react to the state recording details of the Skegness event in such minute detail.
Well, I think it's unacceptable. I think this was an event which was quite open, which attracted, as I said, a lot of people who might not even have been fantastically political or committed to, certainly not necessarily committed to the SWP. I think it was an intrusion into their personal lives, and it was completely unnecessary. All that happened at Skegness was a whole series of meetings, some of which were similar to ones reproduced in other, either in districts or Marxism or in any of these other things. They were totally open. They weren't subversive. They covered a whole range of things. Paul Foote used to come and speak about a whole range of things, about Shelley or the poet, or about things that really were not even immediately applicable to day-to-day activity. They were obviously very, very popular. People would have, there was a debate, I remember one year, about whether sport would exist under socialism and things like that. You know, so it was completely unnecessary. I think a complete waste of money. And of course, an intrusion when you do start recording children and infants as part of the people attending it, but indeed also an intrusion on the adults here, because we know that some of these names will have been used perhaps in terms of blacklisting and other things like that. So yeah, I think you can say it was a totally unnecessary and intrusive operation which shouldn't have happened.
If we could take that down now, please, and go to 1990, which is tab 14, sir. 10088 for the projector. If we orientate ourselves a little bit to 1990 by looking at paragraph 2, first of all, which records that between Friday the 13th and Monday the 16th of April 1990, the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, held its annual Easter rally at the Skegness Sands Holiday Camp, Roman Bank, Skegness, Lincolnshire. This event followed its usual format by being a lively mixture of lectures and discussions which were followed, although often replaced by a good deal of social activity. Approximately 3,000 party members and 300 non-member contacts attended the event from all over the country. Some 45 lectures and discussions were given by about 33 speakers. A copy of the full programme of events is attached. So precisely as you've just described it. If we look, I'm going to take you to 2 more paragraphs before the question. First of all, if we could go on the next page to paragraph 7. These factors reinforce the belief by the party hierarchy that the SWP was taking on a new position within the political far left. Traditionally disillusioned Labour Party left-wingers often turned to the Communist Party as an alternative. Now, however, it would appear that with the near collapse of the Communist Party in the UK, the SWP is beginning to take over this role. keeping that in mind, over the page to paragraph 10, please. In conclusion, it can be said that SWP members left the weekend rally in a highly excited mood, seeing the party as being on the threshold of becoming much larger and with increased importance in the political sphere. The vast majority of members felt that the rally had been the most inspiring and enjoyable for many years. The picture that's being painted is that this is the end of the Cold War era. The Communist Party is fading away, and the SWP is able to take on a more prominent role on the left of British politics. Is that an accurate picture? Was there a post-Cold War fillip for the SWP?
Well, we've referred to this a little bit earlier. I mean, I would say this is a kind of a bit of a jumble, this sort of thing. I mean, firstly, people tended to leave Skegness in a highly excited mood. I mean, it was, they very much enjoyed it. There was a final rally on the final morning, and people went off happy and seeing their tasks for the next few months as something that they wanted to adopt. Now, this question of the Cold War and people becoming much larger, I think there's two different things here. The Communist Party obviously went into rapid decline after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and therefore wasn't in a position to take many initiatives. It split into all sorts of different ways. Whether or not that would have been the case that we then took over from them, I think is much more unlikely to be the case. As I said to you, we benefited to a certain extent from having the analysis that we had on Russia and the Eastern Bloc, but not to a massive extent. What did happen at that period and in the subsequent years was that whereas when I first joined the SWP or IS, the Communist Party was very big. It was 30,000 people, something like that, and was a major force in the trade unions and in other campaigns. And therefore, trying to get a niche where you could operate in that situation was much, much harder for us. By the 90s, they didn't present that kind of they didn't have the same large organisation. They didn't present the same kind of block to other people being able to do things. So in that sense, I think it made it easier for the SWP, but I don't think it was really that we were in that it was hugely advantageous to us. So perhaps maybe they didn't quite get the perspective right in this report of, maybe they've condensed something there. I'm not quite sure that it's totally accurate.
If we move back a page to paragraph 8, please, which starts at the bottom of one page and moves over to the next. Poll tax now, please. Throughout the weekend, anti-poll tax activity and the current situation in Eastern Europe were frequently discussed, both formally and informally. After the violent anti-poll tax demonstration in London on the 31st of March 1990, it was commonly felt by SWP members that they would receive a hostile reaction from members of the public as a result of the party's high profile at the demonstration. It was the experience of party members that, in fact, the reverse was true. People did not generally see the SWP as having organised any of the violence, but they believed that the riot resulted spontaneously from the high level of anger that people felt. Now, this may be a rare example of the SWP and the SDS being on the same page.
Very rare, yeah.
But I'm not going to bet on it. I'm going to give you the chance to comment. How accurate is that?
Well, it's not quite accurate because actually I don't think we felt that we would receive a hostile reaction from members of the public as a result of the party's high profile at the demonstration. The second bit is actually the case, that people did understand it. And you've got to remember that there was the poll tax demonstration, which ended in the riot on the Saturday. Now, the next day, David Waddington, who was then the Home Secretary, tried to do a sort of walkabout in Soho, where there was some damage to buildings and so on, and tried to, use that as a means of saying how terrible the thing was. And he had to abandon it because so many people, just passers-by, I mean, it wasn't a demonstration, started saying to him, look, this is your fault, and it's because of the poll tax. And the poll tax was a huge, huge issue. And it caused major demonstrations in every town hall. In Hackney, where I lived, there was a huge demonstration, which actually did end in a riot, although I was somewhere else in London at the time doing a meeting. I had no idea what was happening until I got back and saw the estate agent at the end of my road had their windows broken. People were very, very angry about it, because it meant that for many families, they were going to be paying 3, 4, 5 times as much for their poll tax as they paid for rates, and people felt it was totally unjust. And it was totally unjust. When they said that the Duke will pay the same as the dustman, well, people felt, no, the Duke should be paying more than the dustman for their local services. So I don't think ever it was, of course, the media and the politicians said this is terrible, it can't be allowed to happen, all the sort of things as they always do after this. I think lots of people in ordinary society felt that it was at least understandable that the poll tax had ended in the way that it did, and that there had been that level of riot, and it was spontaneous. So the second part of that paragraph I would agree with, but perhaps not the first.
Okay. If we take that down now, please. I'm going to move now to the annual Marxism event, another big date in the SWP calendar, wasn't it? And this was it a slightly more cerebral event?
Yes, it was, although there was a fair amount of socialising went on at that, but it was an event at a university in London. It was, there were meetings on Marxist theory, as well as sort of more popular meetings on topical things, or on history, or on all those things, yeah.
Again, very heavily reported upon.
I know, and completely unjustified. I mean, this was a public event. Anybody could buy a ticket and come to it. The idea that there was any need for any kind of undercover policing is just ludicrous, really.
Well, I'll have to be selective, but let's go first of all to the 1986 event, tab B6, sir, 745542. This is an intelligence report which submitted, if we go to the next page, please, see the covering report. It submits the programme for Marxism 86. And there are just a couple of passages in the programme I'd like to ask you about, please. First of all, on page 7, here we're seeing a list of the courses, and there is in the right-hand column a section headed 10 questions for socialists. Near the bottom, the penultimate asterisk, will we need violence to get socialism? I appreciate that in 1986 this was a long lecture. In a nutshell, please, could you give us the answer?
Well, the answer to it is that you don't need violence to get socialism, but you have to be prepared for the violence of the other side. That was always the way in which we put those particular questions. I mean, these questions, as you say, there's a whole list of questions here, and that would have been the answer to it, that actually socialism is a mass democratic process from below, and that the people who don't like this mass democratic process from below are the people who already hold on to the power and wealth in society, and that's what we were challenging. So that would be, in a nutshell, how I would answer that question.
And so, as you said before, violence might be needed in the moment of revolution and to prevent a counter-revolution.
You know, with the, I don't know if you've, with the October Revolution in Russia, it was always said that more people were killed in the filming of Eisenstein's October, which was about 10 years later, than were actually killed in the October Revolution. That may be an exaggeration, but not far from an exaggeration. It's actually the people who then resist what happens with the revolution, as they did with the Civil War or the intervention from the Western powers after the revolution, that makes it such a violent event. That was generally our position, and I think it's one that you could say is backed up by a whole number of historical examples.
Indeed. If we could move on to page 9, please. Second part of this programme. The right-hand column, within the box, the school students programme says that this year we are running a special course of meetings for school students, and there will be a special school student ticket. The ticket, which will cost only £5 for the weekend, will provide entry to other meetings and to evening entertainment. The meetings are on what do we mean by revolution? Can the Labour Party bring socialism? Sexism, where does it come from and how can we fight it? Why we need the Socialist Workers' Party. Can we take it from that the SWP did seek to bring its message to school-age children?
Yes, of course, but that when you say school-age children, you'll be talking about teenagers. You won't be talking about, obviously, primary school.
And was that something not just confined to 1986, but generally part of the SWP's work?
Well, it varies very much, but if you look at the whole way in which the movement's developed at different times on a whole range of questions, you'll find that at certain times there's a great deal of interest in politics from school students who, of course, are politically aware on a range of questions. So, yes, we did do that. But it varied as to whether you felt there was an issue that they would be concerned about.
Thank you. If we take that down, and can we now move to 1992? This is B27, 19959. If we set the scene by looking at paragraphs 2 and 3, this is the event was held at the University of London's Mallet Street site and others. In July, there are a total of 250 lectures given by 160 speakers. Some 6,000 persons attended the event, whether just for a single session the weekend or for the entire week, up 1,000 on the year before. Again, these are very popular events, aren't they? Could we move to page 2, paragraph 6? This is a report on the actual proceedings. Paragraph 6, racialism. Racial issues were given a high profile this year, with numerous meetings centred on the role of black people in society. The Los Angeles riots gave particular inspiration to the notion that black people were rising up to change the society which had oppressed them for so long. The party line stressed the importance of converting that anger away from white society and into a class anger against capitalist society. Blacks and whites had to be made to unite in order to defeat the system that oppresses them. How accurate a synopsis of the SWP's position on race is that?
Well, it's of the usual kind of, the lack of understanding of the politics, it does come out. We would never have said blacks and whites had to be made to unite in order to defeat the system that oppresses. And we would say that is what we want to happen, but it's up to black and white people to fight for that to take place. When it comes to the Los Angeles riots, yes, we did think that they were a symptom of black people having been oppressed and still being oppressed in United States society for so long, and that they did want to rise up. But of course, we also said, and this isn't in the report at all, that we believe that riots are a very we don't advocate riots as such. We don't believe they're a particularly they're a reflection of oppression inside society. They're not the best way of dealing with oppression in society, because they can easily be criminalised, and they're not part of an organised response. But I mean, as Martin Luther King said, the riot is the cry of the unheard. That's the phrase that he used. Obviously about the riots in the 1960s, but it very much applied to the Los Angeles riots as well. So, and even as this report stresses, it says that we talk about the way in which it shouldn't just be seen as anger against white society, but also about how do you actually challenge the priorities of capital, and that's what we were talking about.
Who was putting out the message that riots were not the answer?
Well, it was always part of our analysis that we actually said we do not criticise the rioters in the way that the media might do or that the politicians might do, but at the same time we always said they're not the way to actually change society, and that's something that we have been very, very clear about. And for example, if you look at what happened in the early 1980s, one of the arguments we put was that actually the anger from the riots should be channeled into all sorts of other youth organisation, trade union organisation, all those kind of things. Although you have to say, even then, that those riots did actually achieve something, because you got the Scarman inquiry and you got all those things coming out of them. But we never saw riots as a kind of a goal for our organisation. That doesn't, and we never obviously had any control over riots, as is the case with practically every riot that I've ever read about or heard about.
And to what extent was there dissent within the SWP about public disorder? Were there those who thought that they would help to advance the change that you sought?
I don't think so. As I say, I think people were sympathetic for why people rioted. Very sympathetic. And I know, as I mentioned, the one in Hackney that was during the poll tax, I wasn't unsympathetic to why they did it, but I would have liked it to be more channeled into other forms of organisation. And I think that was generally not a very controversial view in the SWP. I think that's a view that everybody would have had. But at the same time, we weren't prepared, as we referred to earlier with the poll tax, we weren't prepared to condemn people or to say that they were criminals in that kind of way, because I didn't think that was an accurate way of talking about the riots either.
Could we move to paragraph 8, please? This is about the ANL. Currently, the membership of the ANL is very large, with about 5 non-SWP members to every 1 member. On the left-wing political scene, it is considered a fashionable thing to join the ANL. Many of the original members have rejoined in order to take a trip down memory lane. However, the active hardcore is almost exclusively made up of SWP members. I'm just going to stop there. Now, this is Marxism 92, so the ANL hasn't been relaunched for all that long by the time this event takes place. Is it broadly accurate that the ANL was very large, with about 5 non-SWP members to every SWP member?
Well, it might have been, but of course you've got to look at the different type of membership of these two organisations. That the SWP obviously required quite a high level of commitment, of paying money, of being involved in activity. That was the whole idea of joining the SWP. When you talk about the ANL, I guess with lots of these members, they were people who signed up to the organisation, but who see that as maybe going on one demonstration or maybe going to a meeting. They're not really comparable in terms of the level of activity that you expect from people. Now, of course, some people in the ANL would have put in as much activity to their activity around this as any SWP member, but many more will have seen themselves as supporters of the ANL, but not doing things every week or not doing things every month. So I don't know where they got that it's a fashionable thing to join the ANL. I'm not sure that was true, but anyway.
Was it true that the active hardcore were almost exclusively SWP members?
I don't think so. There are a lot of SWP members were obviously involved in the ANL, and in many areas they were people who would hold the organisation together. They may be the people who organised the meetings or helped to organise the demonstrations, but there were many other people who were very committed against racism who didn't want to join the SWP, but who would have been in the ANL.
Could we take that down now and go to 1993? This is tab B38, sir, 33975. Now, when this comes up, the first page is actually a slip which we understand has been completed by somebody in the security service commenting upon the SDS's report of Marxism 1993. It starts off, well, in the bottom left, perhaps I should start with, the checkbox marking information provided as extremely valuable. Thank you for this full and excellent report. Of particular interest were the sections on membership, industry, and particularly the party leadership. You, of course, feature in the party leadership. Would you, as a leading member of a revolutionary organisation, would you accept that you would be of interest to the security service?
Well, I accepted that there would be surveillance of socialist organisation because it's always happened, but I didn't agree with it and didn't think it was the right thing to do. As I've always made clear, the SWP was a totally open organisation. It was not a prescribed organisation, and I think that the whole way in which the undercover policing operated within it was completely shocking. The number of people involved in it, the attempts to get into the head office, the deception that went with it, including some really horrific stuff. I think it was. I'm not surprised that they did this, but I think it was really an unacceptable way to behave.
Well, let's look at some of the detail of the reporting from this particular event. The next page, we can orientate ourselves. It says that the attendance was again at around 6,000. There were again 250 separate meetings, lectures, debates and entertainments. If we go over the page to page 3, and I'm interested at the top of that page, most of those attending the various meetings represented the same class and ethnic origin as the bulk of the SWP, i.e. white middle class. About 10% of the participants were black or Asian. 2/3 seemed to be in the 18 to 30 age group, the remaining third being older. I'd just like to give you an opportunity to react to the fact that the attendees at this academic event were being recorded by both class and race and age.
Well, it's what it seems to me is that this is just an attempt to try to dismiss the SWP as a bunch of white middle class people who didn't attract black or Asian people, although it does recognise there were many young people there. I mean, I dispute this whole characteristic of the SWP as white middle class. It had a range of people. It was a very working class organisation. There were many people, not just teachers and people like that, but there were many manual workers. there were miners, there were all those sorts of people. So I don't think it's an accurate thing, but it's also, I don't really quite see the point of it, to tell the truth. I mean, what is this reporting on, and what is it trying to say, really? It doesn't seem to me it's saying very much at all. Or perhaps you can enlighten me. I don't know.
No,
what point you
at this
you
point
think I might be missing. I don't know.
At this point in proceedings, I want to give you a voice on that issue. And now I'm going to move to a slightly different issue on the paragraph below, paragraph 4. This is about the nature of the event. And there's a description here of the event. And I really want to settle on the bottom half of that paragraph. It is also an indication of the respectability of the Marxism event, and that's been put in inverted commas, as probably the largest revolutionary socialist gathering in Europe, that it was attended by many people who are not members of the SWP, including several Labour members of Parliament. In a letter on House of Commons paper, Tony Benn commends the Marxism event as, quote, a necessary school for all serious students of socialism. Would you agree with the late Tony Benn's description?
I think Tony Benn was a good friend, and he came to a lot of events there. Yes, I think he's right. It's a necessary school for all serious students of socialism. It's something that, although he was always in the Labour Party and would never have left the Labour Party, in my opinion, he did understand that the Labour Party was very often, certainly appeared ideology-free and wasn't really interested in education or in history or in learning those kind of things. And I think he saw it as an important event. Yeah, so I would agree with him on that.
If we could take that down.
Sorry, just before we take it down, could I just say about the previous bit, about the thing where they say about all the campaigns that have an axe to grind?
Yes.
I mean, that is a pretty...
Pejorative, isn't it?
Pejorative, yes, that's exactly the word.
Yes. If I took you to every pejorative phrase in the
we'd be
reporting,
here all night,
yeah, we'd be here quite a long time. But you're quite entitled to ventilate that. If we take that down now, please, and can we go to a report on the party leadership that was submitted after the Marxism 93 event, B39, sir, 34066. Now this is, again, a report which has a security service comments slip. Again, it's described as extremely valuable. If we move to the next page, we see it is a report dated the 5th of August 1993 on leadership. If we go over the page, there are two descriptions I wish to ask you about. The first is the second on the second page about you, Dr. German. Lindsey German, respected for her grasp of politics as well as her not insignificant oratorical skills. Her support comes mostly from those of the same gender or those particularly concerned with women's matters, a subject on which she is formidable. Do you agree with that characterisation?
Well, I wouldn't like to say about formidable. No, I don't think it's true. I think the idea that people were mostly concerned with women's matters were the people who supported me, I think is not accurate, actually. There were a lot of people who were interested in these, including some men, but also lots of women. But I also did speak on a whole range of other issues, including class and philosophy and history and all those sorts of things. So, and people either supported me or didn't on the basis of that. So I think there were a fair number of men who would also have supported me, or whatever supported means. You know, it's not a popularity contest, but who would have appreciated what I said about those things, I suppose.
Do you feel pigeonholed by this?
Well, yes, and I'm not entirely surprised given the nature of a lot of the reporting. Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's kind of, that's what women do, but lots of women do a lot more than that. So,
Can we go down to Chris Banbury, please, further down the page? Banbury's speaking skills have improved to such a degree that most comrades now see him as a useful recruiting tool, able to influence the masses by the sheer weight of his oratory. Knowing that his grasp of theory has been considered suspect by his comrades in the past, he has made strenuous efforts to improve it and written several pamphlets in an attempt to prove it. Some of the more intellectual members see Banbury as a future joint leader, whilst yet others favour him as the outright leader. Originally adopted into the Central Committee because of his undoubted skill as an organiser of grassroots activity, it is in this area that Banbury believes his talents are best developed, following the martial endeavours of Trotsky. Banbury believes his talents are best developed following the martial endeavours of Trotsky. Is that correct?
no. I mean, if they're saying he believes his talents are best developed intellectually through writing and so on, is that what this is trying to say, do you think?
Well, what I'm interested in is the bit,
whether
is the bit at the
following
bottom.
Look, he knows a lot about history, including the history of the Red Army and Trotsky's role in that, which of course was absolutely central. He also knows a huge amount about a range of other questions, and therefore the whole way in which this is put, that he somehow suddenly developed these ideas of history and theory, isn't accurate. He always had both those sides to him. He was always capable of writing. He has written a number of books, and it says here he wrote the pamphlets. So I don't think it's the Trotsky martial endeavours is one aspect of what he's interested in, but there's a lot, you can go to the bookshop down the road and find a lot of stuff on military history. It's not unique. It's not unique to him or indeed to the left.
Well, if the apex of Trotsky's martial endeavours were leading the Red Army, it started with leading demonstrations on the street, didn't it?
Well, I don't know how many demonstrations on the streets Trotsky organised. He was in exile for many, many years. I mean, he wasn't, he went back to Russia in 1917. So, by which point there'd been the first revolution. So I'm not sure his key role was was organising the kind of demonstrations we organise in this country in conditions of legality. So if you think there's a kind of link between maybe he organised a demonstration about shortages of food and then managed to lead the Red Army, I don't think that's quite the way it worked, really.
I don't think it, I mean, this is 78's reporting, and we can ask 78 in due course.
That would be
I suspect he's not alluding to leading the Red Army, rather leading the SWP in demonstrations.
Yes, and I know he's referred to this in other places, and it's just simply, to read back somebody who's interested in Clausewitz, who's interested in military tactics, who's interested, obviously, politically in Trotsky as well, to read back to that what you would do on a demonstration on a particular day in London seems to me farcical. I think it seems to me that he has some kind of problem with Banbury, which I don't quite know what that's about, but maybe you can find that out as well.
Thank you. So would this be a convenient moment to let the stenographer have a break?
Certainly would. Could my device be set up so that it shows the transcript? Thank you. 15 minutes.
Dr. German, can we resume with the last of the reports about Marxism events that I'd like to take you to this morning? It's the document, sir, at tab B54, 0245 347. (1995), paragraph 2, for the scene setting, approximately 6,500 registered for Marxism 95, some 30% of whom were not party members, sponsored by a total of 57 trade unions. Is that about right?
I guess so, yeah.
What I want to put to you from this report, though, is the way that the SWP's relationship with the ANL is described. Could we start, please, on page 2 at the bottom, paragraph 12? It reads, the SWP's main tool against fascism is the Anti-Nazi League. The League was relegated from its usual centre stage position at Marxism, and there are questions being asked openly as to the value of keeping the League going. The lack of street activity by the BNP has contributed to the massive drop in ANL membership over the past 12 months. From its peak of 90,000, 40,000 of whom paid monthly subscriptions to the League, ANL membership has now fallen to an estimated 8,000. Stop there. Is it right that by this stage, by the mid-90s, the threat from the BNP was receding?
Well, it was receding, yes. They'd closed the bookshop at Welling, and yes, it was receding. So that obviously has an effect on ANL membership and activity.
And would the SWP regard itself as having played an important role in chasing the BNP from the streets?
Yes, we would have done, yeah.
And it would follow, would it, that that is why ANL membership was declining?
Well, I don't know whether this is accurate about, it seems to me it's a very big fall. And I don't know, this is the report, I don't know how accurate it is, whether this was reported. I doubt it at Marxism, but I may be wrong. So this may be just on the basis of kind of talking to people in bars rather than any sort of official kind of thing. And the ANL has therefore lost its appeal to the SWP as a pool of potential recruits and a source of ready money. It's just kind of cynical, really. That isn't the case.
That was what I was just about to come to.
Sorry.
My first question was really scene setting, and I'm less interested in the precise numbers and the general trend. Was it right that membership of the ANL was going down because the BNP were receding?
Well, that would be how it worked. I mean, as I say, I can't vouch for any figures, and I don't know the figures myself, but that would be how any campaign works. Whether something big happens, then people get more involved, and when that, for whatever reason, moves on, then less people get involved.
But as to the obviously inflammatory next sentence, the ANL has therefore lost its appeal to the SWP as a pool of potential recruits and as a source of ready money. It goes on. The hardcore of ANL activists is made up almost exclusively of SWP members. If we go on to para 13, several factors militate against a premature winding down of the ANL. Despite its poor financial state, the ANL still has access to funds, such as the proceeds of festivals, etc., on which the SWP can prey. Taking away the pejorative language, and the pejorative choice of words, did the ANL profit the SWP financially in any way?
Not at all. It wasn't. It was a totally separate organisation. Its income would have been totally separate, and there is no way that the ANL would have given money to the SWP. It simply wouldn't have happened. There's absolutely no basis for this allegation, and if you actually look at... Sorry, are you going to ask me more questions?
No,
on it, or-
no, you do carry on.
I mean, I just feel that this is such a distorted view of what will happen. It's true that it had declined. That made absolutely no difference to the SWP's finances one way or the other. But I think it's also... the SWP didn't fear it would get a very negative reaction if it closed down the ANL. It actually understood that there was still a threat of fascism, and therefore it should be kept going in some form, and that our members were committed to keeping it going. So I think this doesn't really do justice to what any discussion there will have been about the ANL and its use. And you can tell, I mean, you describe it quite rightly as pejorative, but it's the whole tone of this all the time, that somehow the SWP is trying to get something out of the ANL, and to, whether it's members, whether it's money, whether it's any of those things, whereas actually the ANL was something that, fighting fascism was something the SWP was totally committed to and always was, and that therefore its commitment was not for its own material gain, but primarily would be to try to defeat or weaken fascism, and that was the point of the operation. So this report just doesn't really understand that, I don't think.
Okay, if we take that down now, I want to take you through a report about a meeting of the East London branches aggregate. It's B32 33345, please. If we move to the next page, please. It's a meeting which is said to have taken place on Saturday, the 24th of October, 1992. About 80 people present. If we scroll down a little bit, we'll see that you are recorded in the first paragraph of text as having been present. The second paragraph reads, branch organisers were urged to proliferate the 3 for me policy to members, i.e. each to sell 3 copies of the newspaper and recruit 3 new members, capitalising on the present surge of public support for the threatened miners. The current emphasis is on building and strengthening the party in readiness for the revolution that leaders believe to be approaching. Did the leadership of the SWP at this point in time communicate to its members that it believed revolution to be approaching?
No. The pit closure programme, which is what this refers to in the autumn of 92, did cause a huge political upset in society, because all the things that Arthur Scargill had said during the miners' strike were now being seen to be proved right. He said they're going to close virtually all the pits. That's exactly what happened. And therefore there were very, very big demonstrations. I remember going on 2 demonstrations, one on a weekday and one at a weekend, both of which were extremely big, with miners and people coming from all over the country. But I think it would have been foolish for us to think that was anything other than a reaction to the pit closures. It could have led to a much bigger political movement. For a whole variety of reasons it didn't. I mean, it did actually do sort of permanent damage to the Tory government, which had not long been re-elected, but it didn't. We certainly didn't think that it meant that we were about to have a revolution. That certainly, and nobody would have said that. So this is more, embellishment of what actually anybody would have said.
There were, though, a number of respects in which the SWP was riding high at this period, weren't there? Your membership was relatively high compared to historic levels. There may have been a little bit of a fillip from the end of the Cold War. You were taking on the fascists. You were supporting those such as the miners and industrial disputes. We've seen some of the reports with your members coming out of meetings on a high not long before this. Was it right, though, that relatively speaking, the SWP felt itself to be in a good and strong position at this stage?
Well, I think that whenever you have a big movement like the miners, the campaign against pit closures, of course, that's a good environment for socialists to be in, and that every socialist, you always want to encourage those sorts of things. But I don't think that we particularly thought this was an opening up of politics. There were two things that happened that autumn. One was the collapse of the exchange rate mechanism, and the other was the miners' demonstration. And both of them led to a real decline in support for the Tory government. But of course, it hung on until 97, so we still had 5 more years of it. It did change the political atmosphere, but I wouldn't say in such a way that we were feeling we were about to massively recruit. And anyway, I forget what the figures exactly were that you showed earlier, but let's say 6,000 or 8,000 members around this time. I mean, this is hardly a mass organisation, to tell the truth. So I think we would have been quite realistic that that wasn't going to happen. And you referred to people coming out of Skegness, but that was in 1990, where you said people came out, or the report said people came out very much inspired. But that was 2 years before. So I think there was a much more realistic sense of what was possible and what was likely within the SWP than anything that you get from this report.
Okay, we can take that down now. I want to ask you about some of the evidence Mr. Morris has given us in his witness statement. He describes himself as having been a senior ANL organiser for East London. I would like to ask you, first of all, do you recognise that as an accurate description of the role he held?
I don't at all, and I reject the whole notion of it. I know absolutely categorically that Julie Waterson would never have asked him to be a senior organiser. She might or might not have asked him to be an organiser, but she would never have used that term. We didn't talk about senior organisers and junior organisers, so that's just, I think it's him trying to promote his own role, to be honest.
Are you able to help us with what his role within the ANL in East London actually was?
Well, I can't believe it was a particularly central role. After all, I was thinking about this. He obviously had his own cover job, and therefore he wasn't going to be working full-time as an organiser for the ANL, and I don't think there's any suggestion that he was paid to do that. So this would have been something where presumably he'd be doing things maybe a few nights a week or at weekends, maybe going on a demonstration. It wouldn't have amounted to more than that. So I think there's a constant tendency from him to embellish and to exaggerate his role in these things. And I certainly don't think he played a particularly central, let alone a senior role in East London at the time.
And would you, as a member of the Central Committee, to have been in a good position to know?
Well, I would know who was involved in organising, and I did know, and I still do know some of the people, obviously, who were involved in organising at the time. And I also lived not in Tower Hamlets, but in Hackney, which is where he was active a lot of the time. So I would have been aware if he'd been central to it, or if, as he claimed as well, that he was very friendly with Julie. And I don't think, I think I would have known that, and that wasn't the case.
Could we now move to some specific demonstrations? And the first two I want to go to are from the Wapping dispute. The first is 2136, please. It's not in the bundle, sir. This is a report from the 18th of February 1986. The report does not identify you as present. Can you recall whether you were present at a demonstration in Wapping in February 1986?
I can't recall whether I was exactly at this one, but I was at a whole number of the demonstrations, so I probably was
Okay, well,
at this one.
when we get into the details,
maybe I can enlighten you more. Yeah.
Okay, well, if you look at paragraph 2, this particular demonstration on the 15th involved a march assembling at Tower Hill, according to the report, of approximately 1,100 supporters of the Socialist Workers' Student Society. Members of the Ilkeston branch of the SWP had travelled to London with miners from the Yorkshire area. There were a considerable number of militant supporters and anarchists, according to the report. Although official trade unionists from the print unions headed the march, it was, and I'm now reading, it is evident that they exercised little or no control over the bulk of the demonstrators, which principally comprised representatives of various left-wing factions. This was particularly so when the march was confronted by a police cordon barrier, where the print trade unions were quite content to stop. However, the majority of the other marchers tried to force a way through with little thought of any tactical advantage or reasoning. In pursuance of this aim, during the march, SWP individuals were instructed to make their way to the front and to attempt to disconnect and pull down the crowd control barriers which had been erected across the roadway to stop the progress of the march. Having pushed through the first cordon of police in the highway, it was a success of this dismantling tactic that appeared to cause the first outbreak of violence in Wapping Lane, forcing uniformed police to advance through the unlinked and thereby ineffective barriers and eventually to deploy mounted officers. I can skip paragraph E, which is about others, and go to paragraph F. The London SWP members were controlled with the use of stewards by Paul Holborough, Privacy, who at various stages tried unsuccessfully to liaise with the print unions as leadership as to how the march should be conducted. First of all, does that jog your memory on the question of whether you were there or not?
Not particularly, but because it deals with a specific number of things that allegedly happened, whereas it doesn't talk just about the general thing. But, I mean, can I make a couple of points about this, really, about the whole marches? Because it gives the impression that the printers were kind of almost like a walk-on, were passive observers of the event, and that wasn't the case. It wasn't, I mean, what had happened to those printers was 5,000 of them were sacked by Rupert Murdoch the month before. They were absolutely devastated and they were determined to try to stop the papers coming out from the Murdoch plant in Wapping. That's what the dispute was about, and they were very active in doing so. And if anything, I would say that the printers' unions and the printers at the time were definitely in control of those demonstrations and definitely were not particularly amenable to left groups sometimes. I mean, sometimes they might have been, but quite often they weren't. So I think you need to put it in this context. I think you also need to put it in the context that it talks about, the attempt to dismantle the barriers caused the first outbreak of violence in Wapping Lane, which really doesn't do justice to the role of the policing here, because the role of the policing from the very beginning, and this again is a matter of record, that the role of the policing was to work hand in glove with Murdoch to ensure that the papers got out. That was what they did, and it involved the Home Secretary, it involved all sorts of people. Now, in that situation, to kind of say, look, a month later, people moved some barriers, and that was the reason there was violence, just simply doesn't do justice to what was going on at the time and to the extremely violent nature of the policing at every demonstration that I went on in Wapping that there was.
It's right, isn't it? Feelings were running high.
I would say more than feelings were running high. I mean, these are 5,000 people who'd lost their jobs and they came on the demonstrations with their wives and families. I mean, obviously, there were women print workers, mostly in the clerical, but it was overwhelmingly a male, very well organised, very well paid group of workers, and suddenly Murdoch did this to them, and they were absolutely devastated by it. And there was a whole year where we had these demonstrations until eventually they were defeated. It's also worth saying at this time, I think I'm right by the time of this demonstration, that the funds of the unions had been sequestrated. They'd been frozen by the court, so they couldn't use their funds for anything as a result of the picketing. So they were facing very, very serious opposition from the courts and from the police.
Can you help us with whether or not, on this occasion, the crowd control barriers were disconnected and pulled down?
I really don't know. I don't know the answer to that because I don't remember that happening. As I say, I'm not absolutely categorical that I was on it. But if they were, I wouldn't be absolutely surprised because people were trying to get to stop the lorries going out. That was the aim of the operation. That's why they went to Wapping twice a week.
Would it surprise you if SWP members had been instructed to do that?
It would surprise me if they were instructed to go and dismantle. They may well have been said, go to the front of the demonstration. That's a different thing. But to say we're instructing you to take the barriers apart sounds a little bit unlikely. And also, as the point is made in point F, that Paul Holborough's attempts to liaise with the print union's leadership weren't successful as to how the march should be conducted.
But is such an instruction impossible, or might it have happened?
I can't say it didn't happen, but I think it's very unlikely.
If we could take that down now, please, and go to 28727, again, not in the bundle, sir. This is a month later, a report about a demonstration on the 15th of March 1986. This is a report of HN 95, Stefan Skutz. And the material paragraphs are really 2 and 3. This says that there was a march and that, paragraph C, prior to the march lining up, privacy informed SWP members to ensure that the group did not become and could not be identified as being isolated from the bulk of the march. Inferring that something might happen, he reminded comrades that whilst they should not be provocative themselves, they should be ready to act and to encourage others to do likewise. Pausing there, is that likely to have been the instruction that was given to members of the SWP?
Well, as I interpret this instruction, it says comrades shouldn't be provocative. They should be ready to act and to encourage others to do likewise. Presumably didn't mean to encourage other people to be provocative. If we're saying that we don't want to be provocative, presumably it was encouraging people to be ready to defend themselves and to stick together and to not get split up and to not get isolated. That would be how I would interpret that paragraph, which I don't think reflects badly on the SWP at all.
Well, essentially, can I take it that you're agreeing that that might well have been the instruction given to members?
I think it would have been, which would have been sensible on any demonstration where you think there's going to be violence. And remember, you had riot police, you had police horses, you had all these things all the time. You would say to people, don't, stay in a group. Don't do anything that might get you arrested. Don't do anything that might get you into trouble. And be careful to look after other people.
Now, what, according to the report, then happened? D, the demolition of the perimeter fence in the vicinity of the main gate appeared to be a spontaneous action, prompted by a handful of people marching under a chapel banner, thought to be the Joint Chapel Liaison Committee banner made from a white sheet embossed with black lettering. The group, who began chanting, "Bring it down, bring it down, bring it down," were quickly joined by other trade unionists and, more significantly, by a large number of SWP members who coincidentally had arrived on the scene at that time. Generally being more youthful and possessing a greater feeling of anger, the SWP members quickly provided enthusiasm for the task in hand, which resulted in the fence being pulled to the ground. Are you able to help us with the accuracy of that account?
Well, I'd have thought it's only partly accurate in the sense that the Chapel banner, which Chapel is obviously is the trade union organisation in the print unions, and the Chapel banner went and said it wanted to tear down the perimeter fence for the reasons that we've just discussed, that they wanted to stop the lorries going out. So this group started chanting, "Bring it down." Surprise, surprise, given these reports. It then says, a large number of SWP members coincidentally had arrived on the scene. So, in other words, whatever happened, it happened through the Chapel banner, not through the SWP who coincidentally arrived on the scene and would not have been responsible for pulling the fence to the ground, because that was already happening, as I understand it, from this, even by this report itself makes that clear.
Were you at this demonstration?
I think I was, but I can't. There were so many. I don't mean to be difficult about this, but there were so many demonstrations, and I must have been over the years, over the course of the year, on a whole number of ones. I do remember one with a lot of horses, and that might have been, in particular, that might have been this night. I don't know, but it's very difficult to just look at the date and then say you were definitely there. But I usually did go on a Saturday night if I was in London, if I didn't have anything else that was happening.
Would the SWP condemn tearing down the fence?
I wouldn't have condemned it, and I don't think the SWP members would either, because if you look at what happened, this was a major operation to destroy a union, and I think that the unions had the right to defend themselves in the way that they thought fit. And you've got to think that this is something that didn't come easily to the print unions. They were a militant group of workers, but they were also quite respectable, very well paid, all that kind of thing. This wasn't what they did every week, was go on demonstrations, and that was a new development for them, brought about by the attacks of Murdoch.
Would it in fact be no surprise if SWP members had participated in tearing down the fence?
There may have been SWP members who participated in it, but they would only have done so as a result of other people doing it.
The report goes on, heartened by this success, attempts were made to use the obsolete crowd control barriers as a means of traversing the rolls of razor wire, barring their way. Whilst not a particularly well-conceived method, it does illustrate the mood of the crowd and their high level of commitment to gain access to the plant when an opportunity presents itself. It was only the sight of the mobilised riot police that dissuaded the crowd from this course of action. Even so, large numbers of demonstrators had to be urged to leave the fence and to await a further opportunity for action. Is it right that, as a generality, that by the time a public order event gets to this level of gravity, it takes something like a significant number of riot police to restore order?
I don't agree with that in general. From the demonstrations that I've been on and the use of the riot police on many of those, I would say that in every situation they've exacerbated the problem rather than dealt with it. And we can look at that again in a whole number of different contexts. It was true of the poll tax. I think it was true of Welling. I think it's true of a great many of them. And I would suggest that the reason they stopped trying to use the crowd-controlled barriers as a means of traversing the rolls of razor wire were because, as even this report suggests, that wasn't a particularly effective and probably a fairly dangerous thing to do, and that's why it stopped. And this idea of the riot police being the thing that stopped them, I think, is just not true. The riot police were in there to force them back and to force them off the streets, and that's what they did time and time again. And there's a pattern that develops during the Thatcher years and goes on, which is the use of riot police, the use of police horses in very large numbers, and the consequences of that in terms of creating a situation where you get violence on the demonstration.
Presumably, though, if the police hadn't been there on this occasion, the striking workers and their supporters would have gained access to the printing plant.
Well, that's what they wanted to do. So, but anyway, there's no question that the police wouldn't have been there. We're talking about the nature of the police and the sort of police that were there and what their aim was. And their aim time and time again, as somebody who went on many of these demonstrations, was actually to try to attack the demonstrators and to make it impossible for them to picket in an effective way. And that was, again, that was a strategy which Murdoch had, and Murdoch worked very, very closely with the police and the government over this.
Thank you. Could we take that down now, please? I want to move to another demonstration now that was in Grosvenor Square and then Oxford Street. Could we have up 18923, please? This is another report of HN 95, Stefan Skutz. Dated the 22nd of April 1986. If we look on page 1, briefly to set the scene, we can see that it was a demonstration in central London on Saturday the 19th of April 1986, organised by CND in protests at the then recent events in Libya. And most of that page is about matters in Grosvenor Square. So far as the SWP is concerned, paragraph D says it was evident that the majority of demonstrators were inclined towards more passive means of protest and were not generally supportive of such SWP-inspired chants to burn down and storm the United States Embassy or for the Prime Minister to be booked into the Grand Hotel at Brighton. Only by injecting humour into the chants did the SWP gain any real support from the bulk of the demonstrators, and eventually the SWP was resigned to such banal activities as exhorting photographers employed on the rooftops to jump. Would chanting, which many might feel was in rather poor taste, have been common on an SWP supported demonstration?
I take this as the reference to the Grand Hotel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been. I've never heard that chant on any demonstration. I'm not saying it never took place, but I've never heard it, and it would be very surprising. It's not really a very political chant, so it wouldn't have been one that we would have been keen on, nor would we have we would have chanted to burn down and storm the United States Embassy. I mean, anybody who's been to the old embassy in Grosvenor Square would have known that was a complete impossibility and that you wouldn't even think about doing it. So I don't really know where they get that that idea about people on demonstrations do shout jump sometimes when they see photographers on the roof, but that's rather a different category of things.
Might on this occasion there have been some particularly bawdy members protesting?
Sorry, what members?
Particularly bawdy.
No, why would there be?
I'm just wondering.
Sorry. No,
exploring why it may be that an officer has reported that these things were said.
Well, I can't speak for every single person who was on that demonstration, but I find it a very odd chant for people to make, and I'm pretty certain it wouldn't have been SWP members if anybody made it.
Could we go to the next page, please? Things move to Oxford Street, where, according to the report, there's a sit-down protest. Paragraph F says, the sit-down in Oxford Street afforded the SWP an opportunity to assemble as a group, which they did outside the main entrance to Selfridge's department store. Under the leadership of Privacy and Privacy, the SWP continued in its vitriolic anti-US and anti-establishment chants. And then if we can go down to I, please. Although the SWP did not pre-plan any opposition to police tactics nor provide effective directions once the disorder was in progress, they did utilise the more passive protesters as fodder and organise the collection of missiles to throw at police. The initial confrontation, however, was more of a spontaneous reaction by like-minded comrades and experienced demonstrators seizing the opportunity to create disorder. So the picture being painted by the officer is of a breakdown of disorder, missiles being thrown at the police, and their collection having been organised by members of the SWP. Are you able to help us with whether that is accurate or not?
I remember this demonstration pretty well, actually, because it was the bombing of Libya by the United States, which was facilitated by Britain. Now, this was after a very long period. I mean, now we talk about bombing much more commonly, but in 86, there hadn't been anything like this since the Vietnam War, really, this kind of thing. And I was amazed at how big the demonstration was. I mean, it's probably, I don't know, 10 or 15,000 people. Just came quite spontaneously at very short notice, the day after it happened, as I remembered. As it says in this report, the SWP was only a very, very small part of this. It was a couple of hundred people, according to this report, and that may well be accurate. People were it was organised by CND, who obviously had been involved in the big protests early in the 80s about cruise missiles and so on. But by 86, there was less activity around that. But it captured an absolute outrage from people that the Americans had done this. And particularly, I know they bombed Gaddafi's home and killed one of his children. And so there was a lot of real outrage about it. And it went from Grosvenor Square to Oxford Street, and people sat down in the road. That's what happened. There was a blockage of Oxford Street. People sat down very near Selfridges, as it described, so outside Selfridges and around that kind of bit of it. And I remember a bus being stuck in the crowd. You know, it couldn't go forward or back because there were people in front and behind and at the side of it and everything else. I don't recall it as a particularly... It was a passive resistance, if you like. It was people sitting down, which is a long tradition of CND. It's a long tradition of other, the civil rights movement in the US and so on. It's a long tradition. And it was that, I think, that was the thing that actually was the key to that whole sort of demonstration. And the things about the collection of missiles, that we organised the collection of missiles to throw at the police, just wouldn't be what we would do. And again, it may be that people threw placards, sticks, or threw placards towards the police. I don't recall that, and I don't recall it being like that. What I do recall is a mass of people who were absolutely incensed at what the US had done, and incensed at the role of our government, and who saw it as a kind of, as it became the sign of more military intervention, as we've now had for the last 30 or so years.
I'm taking it from your answer, Dr. German, that you were present.
I was present, yeah.
And would I be right to infer from your answer that you did see some form of missile thrown, placards and so forth?
No, it wouldn't be right to infer that. There may have been, but I don't recall seeing it, which doesn't mean that, I just can't be categorical about that. But it was overwhelmingly a peaceful demonstration. I think that's important to underline in this.
Could we go to paragraph 3, please? In this particular demonstration, the SWP will not have had to consider the dangers of substituting itself and will regard Saturday's events as a morale-boosting success. Whilst the SWP does not seek, and indeed does not have the necessary authority to instigate violent confrontation, it will continue to take advantage of any opportunity that may arise at future demonstrations. The only danger for the SWP is how its activities on Saturday are perceived by the wider peace movement, and it is likely that the SWP will find itself more isolated and consequently unwelcome at future demonstrations organised by the CND. As a member of the Central Committee at the Material Time, can you tell us, Dr. German, whether this event soured the relationship between CND and the SWP?
I don't know where this comes from at all. I don't remember that the SWP was at all isolated after the demonstration. As I've said, it was a pretty small part of the demonstration, and my recollection of how people felt after the demonstration, both inside the SWP but wider, in the movement, in the peace movement, was that people felt that it had been a successful protest and a big protest, and therefore they felt this was something. I don't recall us being particularly criticised at all for it, to the best of my recollection.
Can we take that down now, please? And I'd like to take you to documents reporting events which were not violent. Now, the first of those is at tab B10, sir, 10173. This is a report dated the 25th of April 1989, paragraph 2, with reference to the march and rally at Southall on the 23rd of April 89 to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the death of the Socialist Workers' Party activist Blair Peach. The report then goes on to list members or associates of the SWP identified as being present. You feature on that list at the bottom of the page. This is a report of HN 90s. Can you help us with what the atmosphere was like on that occasion?
Well, it was 10 years after. Blair was a friend of mine and obviously a fellow member of the SWP. People were very respectful. People were very sad about it. And I think by that time as well, there'd been inside the community in Southall, there'd been a great deal of wanting to commemorate Blair Peach. And in fact, there's a primary school in Southall that's still named after him because he was killed on that day trying to defend people against the fascists. So I think it was a perfectly normal demonstration. I don't remember any particular incidents that happened at it. It was just a memorial march, really. That was the point of it.
No disorder is mentioned in the report. Can I take it from that there wasn't any?
Well, if maybe for once we coincide with me and the report, I don't know. I don't remember it, and it would have been quite inappropriate. It would have been. There would have been community leaders from Southall speaking. There would have been all sorts of different people represented there. There'd be people from the teachers because he was in the teachers' union, and I just think people would have seen it as a memorial rather than any kind of other sort of demonstration.
What was the likelihood of disorder at this demonstration?
Well, it doesn't look to me like there was very much at all.
I'm thinking, if you were asking yourself the day before, is there going to be any disorder at this event?
Well, you can't always tell with demonstrations, to be perfectly honest. But no, I would have assumed there wouldn't have been a great deal of threat of disorder at that point.
Can we take that down, please, and go to tab B11, sir, 10229. This is a report dated the 15th of August 1989. says on the 12th of August 1989, the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP, took part in the Time to Go march and carnival in North London. Would I be right in thinking that the Time to Go was a reference to the government?
No, it would be about Northern Ireland.
It's about Northern Ireland,
yeah,
thank you.
it would be about the troops leaving Northern
So it's
Ireland. I think that would be what I would assume it was. And it was in North London in an Irish area. I guess that's what it was.
Thank you. From approximately 10:30 a.m, demonstrators began arriving at Whittington Park, Holloway Road, N19 for the march. After a short rally, the march, consisting of several thousand demonstrators, set off at approximately 1 p.m. for the carnival at Finsbury Park. The march was good-humoured and orderly, and then the report goes on to identify everyone that they could that was present, and you feature on that list. So to state perhaps the obvious, the SWP most certainly could participate in demonstrations that were entirely peaceful.
Well, I'd say more than that most demonstrations that the SWP participated in and do participate in are peaceful. And I think it's unfortunate that sometimes, you know, the things that are highlighted here are these ones where there is some element of disorder. And I think it gives a distorted picture of what the SWP stands for and what it does. I mean, there are, and not just the SWP, I mean, there are thousands of demonstrations every year. Most of them don't make the headlines about anything or on a whole range of very, very useful issues. So yes, of course, it's true we participated in demonstrations. We always set out for our demonstrations to be peaceful, and that was because if you're bringing large numbers of people together, that's what you want to do. So to reiterate, I think when you look at the ones that aren't like this, then you begin to see a pattern emerging, and that is the pattern of the policing.
Well, I wanted to move on to exploring what the risk factors, if I call them that, might be. Would it be right that a tense industrial dispute is more likely to give rise to disorder than perhaps a commemoration march?
It might be, but I mean, I'm not sure how you can kind of generalise over these things. I would say that when you look at where you think there is going to be a problem, then very often it is because the police are determined on one course of action. And this is, I think it was very, very clear with Wapping that this was the case. And I think it was very, very clear with things like Welling. I mean, there's a particular pattern with the police, which is that they decide they're going to police in a certain way. And that isn't always true with the police. I mean, there are a great many demonstrations where you don't have riot police, where you don't have that kind of policing, and where you have a level of cooperation with the police. And that is probably what happens with most demonstrations.
Would it be fair to take what you've said a step further, that you may well get trouble where the police are determined on one course of action and the protesters determined on another?
Well, that's putting it slightly the wrong way round, isn't it? Because actually, if the protesters are saying we want to do X and they're going from A to B, and the police are then saying, no, we're not going to let you do this, or we're not going to let you succeed in your aim, then that's the way in which I would put it. And I don't think you can take the view, really, that, you know, you look at these, you know, you've highlighted a number of protests, and no doubt we'll highlight some more. And obviously, you know, what you're saying over some of them is the SWP were there, as were lots of other groups and so on. The left was there. There was also disorder, sort of QED. Well, it isn't really QED because firstly, because most of the demonstrations that we're talking about actually are completely peaceful, but also because it's just simply, it's simply not realistic to look at some of those demonstrations where there was a lot of violence and to see that as anything other than aggressive policing. And we talked about in the last tranche about Blair Peach's actual killing in Southall, but it's true with a whole number of them. And I think that has to be recognised when we're looking at the policing that's going on, and that the role of the undercover officers and the way in which they tend to always blame it on the SWP rather than looking at the wider questions.
Would a demonstration against the far right be a risk factor?
Well, again, that depends. There are, again, there's many demonstrations against the far right where there is no risk factor of violence at all. But obviously we know two things about the far right demonstrations. One is that the far right themselves are extremely violent, and the second is that if you look at most of those, the police are usually determined to protect the far right, and that's where some of the problems arise. So yes, but even in those cases, there are quite a few demonstrations against the far right where there isn't any violence.
I'm going to move now to that period in the early 90s when there was a resurgence of far-right activity and the rebirth of the ANL. Can we start, please, with the document 30304? Again, not in the bundle, sir. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen's visit to London in December 1991. The report is dated the 13th of December about events on the 6th. Jean-Marie Le Pen was a far-right French politician, wasn't he? And he has come to London and is attending a dinner, and a number of left-wing organisations are reported as having arranged to demonstrate outside the hotel, including the Socialist Workers' Party. Can you recall this? Were you there?
I wasn't at that demonstration, but I know it. Obviously, it did take place.
And then it says, at paragraph 4, by 8:30 p.m., what had been a vociferous crowd from the start became disorderly. After staging a sit-down in the Strand itself, the protesters made their way down to Trafalgar Square, causing predictable traffic chaos. Arriving back at the hotel about 9:30 p.m., by this time several of their number had been arrested, and there being no sign of Le Pen, SWP members were urged to make their way to Southwark Park Road, SE16, the following morning, as it was rumoured that Le Pen would try and do a walkabout. They dispersed. If we could go to paragraph 6 now. It says the apparent low profile taken by the police on this occasion appeared to encourage the SWP organisers to escalate the disorder in a crowd already angered by what they saw to be fascist provocation. It is estimated that SWP members and supporters numbered about 300 and represented perhaps a third of the total number present. Their organisers were able to influence the entire crowd mainly because of the very limited presence of police on this occasion, a factor which undoubtedly gave them Dutch courage. So the officers who provided the intelligence on which this report is based seem to have formed the view that the SWP would take advantage of inadequate police numbers. Is that a fair description of how the SWP would behave?
Well, I don't think it's an accurate description of the demonstration. As I was aware, there were a considerable number of police on. I wasn't on it myself, but as I was aware, there were a large number of police on it, and I'd be very surprised if there weren't, given the background. I mean, there was a lot of anger about Le Pen. You know, this is the man who had links with fascists, you know, going back to the Vichy regime and the Nazis. He was a man who described the Holocaust as a mere detail of history. So, you know, he had some form, and people were very worried that the growth of Le Pen in France would lead to a rise in fascism across Europe, which unfortunately we are seeing now. And I think that was why you got, according to this report, nearly 1,000 people there. And that is why I would be very, very surprised if there weren't several hundred police there as well. And is there any evidence for this other than maybe the undercover officer didn't think there were enough police there? I don't know. I mean, they don't seem to have any evidence for this. And they also actually say that what the protest took the form of was a sit down in the Strand, which caused traffic chaos, which again is a fairly common form of protest, and these days is also a fairly common form of protest. So I don't quite understand what their point is here. That what they appear to be saying is that you need to have very, very heavy policing in order to have any demonstration. Well, I think that's obviously not the case. I mean, we have demonstrations in all sorts of situations on all sorts of issues where there isn't a massive amount of policing and they pass off completely peacefully and there is no problem. So I think they're trying to make a case here which doesn't really exist.
But might the distinguishing ingredient here being the particularly inflammatory nature of Monsieur Le Pen's visit?
Why would that be a...
As you say, he's a man with considerable form.
But this wasn't a particularly violent demonstration, as I understand it, reading the report. So that doesn't quite fit with it. Yes, but people were, if you like, inflamed by Le Pen, and understandably so. But it seems to me this was a fairly normal protest at a hotel where he was due to speak. And there was a sit down in the road. It doesn't seem to me that turned into anything much bigger than that.
If we could take that down, please, and put up 172, again, not in the bundle, sir. This is, I'm showing you this because it's got comments in a similar vein about policing. It's actually a poll tax demonstration report from March 1990, from HN90, who is one of the two officers who informed the last report. Paragraph 2, to scene set. On Friday, the 9th of March 1990, members of the Socialist Workers' Party took part in an anti-poll tax demonstration outside Lambeth Town Hall, Acre Lane, London SW2. And then paragraph 5. Although the demonstration was reasonably peaceful and good-humoured until the scheduled end, disorder occurred as a result of the actions of the punk-type anarchists who went on a march through the centre of Brixton. Members of the SWP and other left-wing factions joined the procession, anticipating a confrontation with police. However, when it became apparent that the police were well organised, prepared for disorder, and that they well outnumbered the demonstrators, it was only the punk-type anarchists who wished to continue with the confrontation. The majority of the rest dispersed to the pubs and their homes. Very few SWP members were involved in the violence that followed. And again, portrays a picture of police numbers facing down what would otherwise have been more serious disorder. Again, is it in fact right that demonstrators on the ground might take an opportunity for disorder if it presented itself?
No, I mean, I think this sort of line of disorder is only stopped because you have lots and lots of police there just simply isn't the reality for most demonstrations. What I think happened here, if you look at the poll tax demonstrations, they varied. I mean, as I said earlier, when I came back from another part of London, I saw there was one in Hackney. There were riots all over London and all over other parts of the country about the poll tax. It seems to me this is one that didn't go in that direction. I don't think that will have been because of the police. It will have been for a whole number of other reasons. And certainly, as it says here, most people dispersed to the pubs and their homes. Well, most people weren't involved in the in any violence that happens. And I don't think that's to do with the policing. That will be, people will feel that, okay, they've made their point and they can go. They don't feel that they have to stay there. So I think that that's how we should look at that one. It doesn't seem to me, I mean, I don't think that you can, what they seem to be doing all the time is trying to want to increase the level of policing and saying that's the only thing that stops demonstrations from being violent. But that just simply doesn't match reality and doesn't match history and doesn't match anything we know about these things.
Can we take that down, please? I want to move now to the relaunch of the ANL. Could we have up, please, 33502? Sorry, this is not in the bundle as well, sir. This is a report dated the 18th of December 1991. It's covering the submission of a copy of party notes produced for the week ending the 9th of December 1991. It says the notes clearly identify the major projects of the past week and provide information on forthcoming activities and campaign trends. Of major interest this week is a relaunching of the Anti-Nazi League under the leadership of the SWP. In this connection, the party has issued a leaflet, copy attached, explaining to members what it will entail. Could we go over the page, please? And the left-hand column, under the heading Anti-Nazi League Relaunched, it reads, "We have to counter the rise of Nazism in Europe and prevent it getting a toehold here. The Le Pen protests and the reaction to our front page met with a real response. We have decided to take the initiative by relaunching the Anti-Nazi League. Enclosed is a circular that every comrade should read and act on." So can I take it from that that it was an SWP decision to relaunch the ANL?
Yes, but if you read further into the other statement that accompanies it, it makes clear it's an initiative to relaunch it, which will then involve other forces and other people. So yes, but the SWP took the initiative to launch it the first time round. So yes, it was in both cases.
Thank you. And if we could zoom out now, and just whilst we're here, could we look at the next page? Under things they say in the right-hand column, demonstrators, many carrying socialist worker banners, threw flour at Mr. Le Pen as he arrived to address a dinner held by the Western Goals Institute. This is a newsletter, isn't it, that goes out weekly to members of the SWP. Can I take it from the fact that this is being included in that newsletter that throwing flour at an opposition politician is not something that the SWP has any qualms about?
I guess that's the case, and indeed, when I first got involved in politics, people regularly threw eggs and flour and things. I'm not talking about myself, but people did generally in election hustings, and this was quite commonplace. And indeed, Nigel Farage got a milkshake during the election campaign this time, which, whether you think it's a good thing or not, I don't think you can regard it as something that is fundamentally outside of traditional political practice in this country.
Could you take that down, please, now? I'd like to move to an early march to Welling in early 1992, organised by the Roland Adams family campaign. The document is 28278, please. 26th of February 1992, the march is to the BNP headquarters in Welling, and it's going to be followed by a rally. Both the ANL and the SWP are recorded as organisations that were involved. Numbers attended is said to be approximately 2,000, and the event had been widely publicised. The first couple of paragraphs give us an idea. The ARA, who organised the march in conjunction with the RAFC, made it known in an open letter to the SWP that should any violence occur, it would be construed as ANL orchestrated. The SWP ANL leadership, therefore, had instructed their comrades, whilst en route to the venue, that the demonstration should not be allowed to degenerate into a physical conflict, as this would only detract from the issues involved and erode future ANL support. Were you on this march?
No.
In your role as a member of the Central Committee, were you involved in discussions preparatory to this march?
Not that I recall. No, not that I know of.
Why would the ARA be writing to the SWP, essentially, if I paraphrase, to put a shot across the SWP's bows to ensure that the demonstration remained peaceful?
Well, that's a question that obviously they would have to answer, and I haven't seen, I mean, I probably saw at the time, but I haven't seen recently the open letter that they wrote to the SWP. My feeling would be there were a lot of political differences between the ARA and the Anti-Nazi League, and the ARA in particular, when we come on to Welling, didn't support Welling and had a separate demonstration. So the idea that obviously they wanted to underline is that I think they wanted to underline that there should be no physical attempt to stop the fascists or anything like that. And I think the SWP's response to that, according to this report, I think is very sensible. And what it's saying is we shouldn't allow these political differences to mar the demonstration, and we shouldn't allow any accusations of physical conflict to get in the way of what should be a united demonstration. So I think that would be my interpretation of this, and quite rightly, as this report says, as this would only detract from the issues involved, and this was, after all, about a young man who'd been murdered.
Was there a sense that things were more likely to turn violent if the SWP were present?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I know this is, perhaps the way that you want to interpret it, or perhaps the way that these reports want to interpret it, perhaps to justify the level of undercover policing. But the truth is that the ANL participated in these demonstrations as part of a wider collective, and the demonstrations didn't degenerate into anything at all. They were perfectly all right.
Could we move to paragraph 2, please? In the event, the march, the largest section of which was made up of ANL SWP supporters, was in the main peaceful, and the demonstrators remained in good spirits throughout. Nor were there any obvious overt clashes between the ANL and the ARA, even though the latter, who were in firm control of the organisation, had banished the ANL SWP contingent to the rear of the march, from where it was able to take no part in the eventual wreath-laying ceremony. How important to the SWP was it to respect the wishes of Roland Adams's family?
Well, I think we would have done, and we would have obviously wanted to take part in the wreath-laying ceremony, but if that's what the family or the organisers didn't want, then we would respect that. And it sounds like we were at the back of the march, and that's where we stayed, and nothing happened.
Are you able to assist us with the nature of the relationship between the Roland Adams Family Campaign and the SWP?
I think our people in the local area were involved in the campaign, and as far as I know, it was perfectly okay, the relationship. But I know our local organiser down there was involved in the campaign, the full-time organiser. So as far as I know, that was fine. But I don't think particularly we had a relationship as a national organisation to it.
Thank you. Could we zoom back to the document so I can see the next paragraph that I would like to draw attention to, please? Thank you. Yeah, it's paragraph 3. The only discord noted was in fact between the leaders of the SWP-ANL faction, i.e. Julie Waterson and Chris Bambury. They were unable to agree on whether the ANL should make a symbolic gesture outside the bookshop. It had been decided that their section would halt outside the bookshop to indulge in several minutes chanting, but this was subsequently overruled by Waterson on the grounds that it might be difficult to control. Do you have any personal knowledge of this recorded disagreement?
No, I wasn't on the demonstration, but I guess it was a perfectly normal thing that happens on many demonstrations when you make tactical decisions sometimes as you're going along. And it sounds like originally the idea was that they would stop outside the bookshop as a symbolic gesture, but then it was decided by Julie, who looks like in this occasion was making the final decision, that maybe feelings were running high and maybe it would be difficult to control, and that would go against the agreement about not having any disruption on the demonstration. I guess that's what it's about. And that makes perfect sense, really.
Thank you. We can take that document down now. It's right, isn't it, that the SWP gave its support to a number of justice campaigns, didn't it?
Yeah.
Examples might be the Tottenham 3, Brian Douglas, Joy Gardner, Stephen Lawrence.
Yeah.
Why did the SWP do that?
Well, it wasn't unique to the SWP. I think to a lot of people on the left, they were very concerned about, obviously, the racist murders that were taking place in South East London and elsewhere, but also there were many miscarriages of justice that we felt, both in terms of what happened in courts and what happened in terms of the policing, if you take, for example, Joy Gardner. So this was something that we therefore got involved, usually locally in Tottenham or in South East London or wherever it was, and we would get involved in the campaign. We would support demonstrations for the campaign. We would support petitions and all sorts of other things that went on. That was the kind of approach we had.
What's in it for the SWP?
Well, I think this whole idea that everything the SWP is because it has to have something in it for it is not right. We always, the whole aim of our politics has always been to campaign against issues which we think are wrong, whether it's unfairness at work, whether it's equal pay, whether it's fascism, whatever it is. Those have been the things, not because we necessarily get something out of it in a formal way in terms of members or influence or anything else, although obviously you hope that you will do that, but because we think that that will advance the cause of the left, will advance the whole idea of socialism, will advance all those sorts of things. And that is true with the justice campaigns. I mean, I think one of the things over the last, 30 or 40 years has been a number of these justice campaigns which have been very important and still continue to resonate, as do issues like Orgreave, where there's still the inquiry going on. These are issues which I think anybody on the left would see as part of their natural work, and that's how we saw them.
Did the reaction of the relatives of the people who were the subject of the justice campaigns vary?
Of course, because I think it's true to say that in lots of justice campaigns, or in lots of campaigns where people are dealing with personal upset or tragedy sometimes, then of course they very often respond very energetically to wanting to find justice, but sometimes at certain points they want to do that less, or they decide that they don't want to be as involved politically. Sometimes they're very friendly to the left, sometimes they're not friendly to the left. It very much depends. It depends on the individuals concerned, it depends on what the actual issue is.
And what's the response of the SWP in those cases where the family or relations or whoever it may be are not so friendly to the SWP?
Well, then we have to try to respect those. If people don't want the SWP involved, there's not a huge amount you can do about that. But in most cases, I think we still would support demonstrations or public events that those campaigns were organising, but obviously wouldn't play a particularly central role, and would try not to do anything that would in any way be conceived as in any way upsetting the families or creating problems for them.
Thank you. So would this be a convenient time to break?
Certainly. And we'll resume at 2.